Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in today's webinar. Topic is transit-oriented development, the intersection of REITs and infrastructure. I'm Scott Robinson, clinical professor of finance at NYU Schack and director of the REIT Center. I'm joined today by Alan Reagan, director of development at Vornado, Ray Albright, managing director of capital markets at Keel Harbour, and a student of mine, Sabyasachi. Sabya, do you want to open up with your commentary about public-private partnerships and how it relates to transit-oriented development?
Yes, for sure, Scott. Thank you. I would speak up with a few opening thoughts for everyone to think about. The rapidly growing, evolving concept of smart cities ecosystem globally and here in the US has been fueled by the increased consumer awareness of citizen empowerment to live in sustained communities with connected engagement through smart governance, secure systems, smart energy utilization, intelligence transportation system. This is fostering a climate-forward demand to have more well-structured transit-oriented developments. Well-located transit facilities provide a necessary and affordable alternative to driving. For a quick fact, households using public transport save an average of $651 every year, according to a report by Public Transportation and Petroleum Savings. Additionally, eliminating one car for a household of two can substitute up to 30% CO2 emissions. The Federal Transit Administration, or what we know as FDA, estimates that on a national level, the average transit system emits half the CO2 per passenger mile compared with a single occupancy private vehicle. Multiple studies prepared by the American Public Transportation Association, or the AFTA, have quantified emissions avoided by transit to displace car trips by at least 16 million MMTs, or million metric tons of CO2. In addition to the cost savings and positive environmental impact, TODs also improve our quality of life. And this is what we are trying to bring up in this webinar. A well-functioning transit system reduces travel time, shortens journey, and provides non-motorized options, helping to reduce our reliance on automobiles, thereby allowing us to focus on other things. This increases basically our life efficiency. Residents in transit-rich neighborhoods spend 16% less on transportation than those living in exurban neighborhoods. The TODs, particularly commuter rail hubs, serve as nodes of multiple lines of connection. These TODs historically have been a main key driver, I think, to real estate development and real estate asset appreciation in the surrounding market. The need for these critical mass transportation facilities to develop a forward sustained community, a goal which everyone is trying to achieve, is higher than ever as we emerge from this pandemic and evolve into a more complex digital-centric economy. Despite this critical importance of these transit hubs, it's very unfortunate many in local and regional markets are in urgent need of redevelopment or fresh new development. I'll bring up some few examples of successful TODs that has happened, which we are all aware of, but we overlook. The Cranford Crossing, which is like a sleep town for New York City, was used as a train transportation development catalyst for local growth development, just like we'll hear about later in the presentation. Emery Station Plaza in Emeryville, California, developed by Wareham Properties, a similar real estate development company, serves as the main transfer point for Amtrak travelers riding on the California Zephyr service. On the largest size of the spectrum, the entire Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Arlington County is arguably one of the best successful TOD stories in the United States. These was a collection of urban villages which were created in conjunction with new rail and underground lines, acting as a catalyst for the development of over 21 million square footage of office, retail, and commercial space. More than 3,000 hotel rooms have been added and 25,000 residences exist in this Arlington area. And we all know Arlington is basically an additional subsection of Washington, D.C., and this has acted as a super catalyst for the significant private development happening there. According to ASC, which has assigned a US transit infrastructure a grade of D-, they say that currently there is a $176 billion backlog of transit infrastructure need. The backlog is expected to only grow more than $270 billion through 2029. And I believe if more of these transit systems fail, it's only going to exponentially increase to maybe like $500 billion. Momentarily, we'll hear more about the various sources of capital available to fund these projects. But at the federal level, several programs prioritize planning and funding for multimodal transportation systems and the development of services near transit stops. Agencies such as the US DOT, the Department of Housing, HUD, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, who share common goals to have more connected developments, have pockets of funding, but these are time consuming to coordinate all of these together and plan required to work through these agencies. Basic structural upgrades with the capacity and technological enhancements are complex and expensive. And most of us on this call would very easily understand how much cost would go into a simple real estate project. Imagine how much more would go into a real asset project or more infrastructure development project. A cost estimate to bring towns and cities with these facilities of smart technology, smart enhancement, intelligent transportation systems is difficult to quantify at this moment because the diverse array of ownership structures across jurisdictions and market segmentation. But even a conservative estimate, as I was referring earlier, could run into trillions. I would also like to bring up some few recent high-profile projects which is currently slated to receive funding. Some of them include the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District, or BART, which will receive funding to plan for the TOD at 9 existing heavy rail BART stations along the green and orange line from Fruitville South to Warm Springs, South Fremont, for those who understand these California geography. The Jacksonville Transportation Authority in Florida will receive funding to plan for TOD at 4 stations in the initial phase of the proposal of the 38.4-mile First Coast commuter rail transportation in Northeast Florida. This project can become even more important as we see people moving more into Florida and increasing the stress of the infrastructure system out there. The North Carolina Department of Transportation will receive a funding to plan for TOD development at 13 stations along a proposed passenger railway corridor between Sanford and Henderson, connecting rural and urban areas in this new Golden Triangle region. The Southeastern Pennsylvania Transport Authority, or SEPTA, which is basically the organization which runs the entire transportation system from Philadelphia into the main line, will receive funding to plan for TOD at 5 stations, the proposal for the 4-mile King of Prussia railway station extension of the Norristown Highway Speed Line. The Capital Metropolitan Transportation Authority in Austin, Texas, again moving back down south, will receive further planning to move forward with 13 stations, the proposed Blue and Orange Line railway project stations. All of these are these are one of the few examples which was brought up. There are more new projects which are happening around the country, and it's a time for all of us in the real estate and the real assets industry to basically think about how much more can be done. The amount of public and capital available for transit-oriented development and smart city goals is distressfully inadequate, presenting a very compelling opportunity for private capital markets. This webinar is also a cause for us to pause and think here for students at NYU Schack who are experienced in finance and real estate development to pause and think more about the possible opportunities we could all contribute in the real estate and the real assets market to be involved in ventures. The main reason forward is to bring continued impact. Scott, how would you like to forward this conversation?
Thanks, Sabya. That was fantastic. You brought up some really good points. There's so many different aspects of transit-oriented development we could talk about, whether it's climate impact, quality of life, smart city technology, so on and so forth. But I think, given what's going on in today's world with interest rates, economic recovery, and infrastructure spending, we would love for us to focus a little bit more on the capital markets aspect and how we can structure and fund transit-oriented development, bringing together public investment and as well as private investment, right? And so What we'll do, we're going to hear from Alan, who is also an alum of our program, a little bit later on the discussion to talk about the work they're doing at Farley Building and what the PPP structure looks like over at Penn Station from Vornado's point of view. But I think we'll kick things off with Ray, who's going to talk about another type of transit-oriented development, this one more highway-centric, but it really brings together a lot of, I think, interesting capital opportunities, as well as alludes to some ways to create extra value over time. And I think as part of that conversation, Ray will be able to lay the groundwork and framework for us a little bit about the PPP type of ecosystem. So with that, Ray, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Scott, for having me here at Schack NYU for this webinar. I'm really happy to be on this panel with Alan and Sabyasachi. And as Sabyasachi said, there's quite a bit to be done, and there's really a funding gap. So my goal today is to just give you a little bit of an introduction as to where I like to operate and have deep experience, which is really that nexus of the public and the private sector, and in particular, the capital sources available. I would hope that you'd be able to take away some thoughts and some creative ideas, not only from today, but also as you proceed into your career. A bit of brief background, as I mentioned, I have deep experience in structured finance, having been on both sides of the ball, so to speak. Started my career at TIA CREF as a private placement investor, and then moved on to run the private placements group at Citigroup, Salomon Brothers. And then following that, I was a founding principal in the Carlyle Infrastructure Fund 1, which was a $1.1 billion infrastructure equity fund, really first of its kind to sort of target that exact edge that I just alluded to, which is public sector and private sector development. And the topic today that I'd like to speak on is transit-oriented development, which can take many forms. First, I'll share a screen with you so that you can see a little bit more about what we're going to talk about today. Please sing out, Scott, or someone else if it's not tracking to the screen.
Yep, got it.
Great. So as we look at the first real slide here. So what is transit-oriented development in the infrastructure context? So let's start by this webinar by starting from a high level, zooming out, and then zooming into Alan and the Farley Building development. And hopefully you'll hear some of my comments echoed as we go through today's webinar. Transit-oriented development can actually take a lot of different forms, as was just mentioned. It's prevalent in various sectors, including rail, seaport, airport, and road, and in various sizes, such as single projects, which are standalone, simple add-ons or enhancements like hotel or residential or retail at existing locations. And where we're really seeing the biggest impact in terms of the headline projects, something in between where there's an existing project or facility, such as an airport, and then a great deal of brownfield development as opposed to greenfield, which is sort of starting with the raw land. Nothing else is there. Brownfield is something that takes an existing project and then expands it and enhances it for the customer. So some examples, as you look around the New York area, for those of you in this area, many of these are probably things that you've either driven by or used and passed through. There's the Metro North Stamford commuter rail station, which is very significant transit-oriented development with retail and parking. There's, of course, JFK and LaGuardia airports, which are the subject of other webinars and lots of public news, both of which are proceeding. And I'm sure you are bearing with all of us as you pass through the construction and the related dislocation of that. Specific to road and to the case study I will present later is the New York and Connecticut rest areas. Connecticut was very pioneering, and I worked on that transaction when I was at Carlyle. And New York just granted last year a similar concession, which is the granting of rights and responsibilities and a share of revenues and return to the private sector in a structure known as a PPP, or as was mentioned earlier, a public-private partnership. And that's where the real rubber meets the road in terms of, you as a, listener here, potentially having an impact on the local market or a local asset, which involves not just public funding, which is substantial, but not bottomless, as well as private funding, which is also substantial, but involves a sharing of risks and opportunities. So transit-oriented development, as I mentioned, it really drives growth and improvement in the overall customer experience for all the constituencies, users, jobs, employees of both companies and nearby businesses, regional tax benefits as well, people who live around the area. This is something that they didn't have before, and is definitely an improvement in their neighborhood. And some of these facilities even also include clean energy, which is kind of an indirect benefit for many of those folks who value that. The driving capital, which I'll come to, can be public, private, or a combination of both. And increasingly, and as I think you'll see in the case of the airports in particular, a very large degree of care is placed on providing local content, including for businesses, jobs, people who are doing construction, and also longer term, when the operating facility is up and running, ongoing jobs. I mentioned the public-private partnership, and this is really the most simple diagram that I could find out there. There are very complicated structures, which we won't get into on this, but essentially involves a private company working with a public authority to deliver goods or services to citizens and users. And those are the key constituents. Let me boil that down to something a little bit more specific. In the case of these rest areas, if anyone here has driven up I-95, the Merritt Parkway, or I-395, you will have seen the redevelopment over the, sort of 2010 to 2015 time period of 23 rest areas. They were in terrible shape. They had leaky underground storage tanks. They had crime. They were dirty. And they were dangerous because trucks were forced to park on the roadways. They're also key assets in the regional infrastructure because some of them, such as Darien, are the last place you could really buy gas on the I-95 corridor, which is really critical to long haul trucking, along with retail motoring. So what happened? The state realized this and said, we know we can't do this ourselves. We would like to invite developers to help us, and we're willing to work out a deal. So after a lot of back and forth, when I was at Carlisle, we were shortlisted, and then we won the rights to develop these retail service areas under a 35-year concession with the state of Connecticut. And importantly, avoided the political backlash of upfront payments, which would tend to be criticized as being one-time fees with no ongoing role or alignment of interest for the public sector. So that's a really key feature here in terms of bringing private capital to the table, is recognizing all of the political and social potential issues that one has to deal with. There was a 5-year redevelopment period. That meant that taking an approach with not having all the rest areas down at the same time, and also learning from the development as one goes along. The output of this transaction was very successful. There was over 500 million of economic benefit. It created hundreds of jobs. The public did not feel that it was a one and done, and so it was sort of the public giving up its rights to something and to a private operator, and then not having any sort of ongoing accountability or alignment of interests. And there was revenue sharing. How did this come to sort of produce numbers? These are somewhat confidential, But the facilities, 10 years ago, were doing very little, as you can see, 5 million. And as we started to redevelop it, that almost doubled between 2010 and 2011. And that trend has continued, along the way. In terms of some of the key aspects to the development, there was an approach to bringing in local parties, including local restaurants. The actual execution team included, Carlisle, which has a major operation in New York, along with partners that were important to the state of Connecticut, including the general contractor, who was Connecticut-based, as well as certain other parties, including Subway, which is also a very large privately held Connecticut-based company. And that was really important in terms of, having an attractive team that would provide an alignment of interest to both public and private stakeholders. So my role in the transaction was to try to find capital for this. I mean, Carlisle had a fund, and we could have executed, entirely under the private equity investment necessary if we desired. To maximize returns for all parties, including the state of Connecticut, some additional capital would be enhancing. So where does one turn? If you're watching this and you desire to go into the equity side and think about how to sort of design and source and put together these deals, you could look at a private equity fund. There are several out there, including Carlisle's, Meridium, Star Infrastructure, Fengate, and there are several other sort of GP/LP private equity funds that are investing in these types of transactions nationally and internationally. There are, as Alan will speak about, more strategic or corporate providers of capital. These include companies. I mentioned earlier, some of these companies could be actually involved in the transaction, as in the case of Subway, which agreed to establish Subway restaurants at each of the service areas. They could also just be straight up third-party capital providers. And this also includes REITs. We looked at raising REIT capital, but ultimately this transaction did not meet the criteria for it to be quote unquote REITable. Second big area of capital sources is the government. We talked earlier, and Alan will go into more detail on this, what's available at the federal level. There are numerous sources of capital from the federal level, as well as the state, local, or regional level. And if you're not an expert, and I'm not, in sort of navigating that part, it really is recommended to consider hiring an advisor who will help source out some of the potential options for raising capital, because it's really quite a complex array of different sources that are available. And I think Alan will get into that in a little bit more detail in terms of what's available for certain kinds of projects. There's a lot of specific criteria that need to be met in order to obtain these grants and support payments from public agencies and other governmental sources. But overall, it's definitely an area of focus, and it can be very important to the long-term success of the transaction. And then finally, debt. Why debt? It's cheaper than equity. It's also important to share risk, and it can provide additional flexibilities. For example, banks can provide periodic draws on a delay basis based on milestones in construction. So within infrastructure, there are a number of banks, both US as well as international banks from Japan, Europe primarily, and some of the Canadian institutions as well, that provide infrastructure financing on a senior secured basis to projects like Connecticut. Tax exempt. We spent a lot of time looking at tax exempt financing. Why is that? Because of the long-term nature of the cash flows under the concession. So it's a 35-year concession. Tax exempt financing in general is going to be less expensive than taxable financing, holding the maturity the same. And so we looked at private activity bonds and IRBs and other structures. Too much to go into in terms of detail, perhaps on this webinar, and I'm happy to answer any follow-ups. But unfortunately for us at the time, other than the fact that the on-ramps and off-ramps to the rest areas could have qualified for some financing through the various complexities of obtaining these private activity bonds, the rest of the improvements do not qualify for that type of tax-exempt financing. Revenue unsecured debt is what I like to call all the other kinds of debt that's not equity. So in other words, the banks who come in on a first lien basis or tax exempt financing, that's looking pretty much at the revenue line of the project and has a first claim on the cash flows for debt service. But there are a number of other providers of capital that is somewhere between the debt bank cost of capital and the equity cost of capital that are worth approaching and talking with to see if you can iterate around a structure. Such a discussion was going on, for example, at JFK. Holdco, what does that mean? Well, it's just providing financing has a claim on cash flows ahead of the equity or behind the banks and allows for a lot more flexibility, but at a higher price. Subordinated debt as well within the structure, provided that the first lien lenders such as banks and tax exempt lenders, tax exempt bonds can allow for a second lien position, which is often not the case, but there are certainly ways to structure around that. And then finally, once the project has matured and stabilized, oftentimes you'll see the bank debt taken out because and refinanced, because the banks are usually around 5 to 7 years. And there are privately placed taxable long-term bonds that basically match the cash flows of the project on a long-term basis. And those are available in the private placement market from insurance companies and pension funds. So with that, I'll just stop there. I hope that that's been helpful in giving you a little bit of lay of the land of the fact that, one, projects can be very large and flexibly structured. Two, capital can come from a wide variety of sources. Three, it's very complex. And so some experience here with advisors or with strong developers, such as Alan, is critical to the success of the project. And that leads me to the final point, which is the counterparty fit is really, really critical. So it's, I'm sure Alan will talk about that a little bit more, but that's having some trust in the ability to talk with the public sector, have the public sector participants and the private sector participants really have a good fit, is really one of the underpinnings of any infrastructure transit-oriented development project. And I'll pause there.
That's great. Thanks, Ray. Appreciate that overview. And I thought that was a great example. I mean, it's really most infrastructure and PPP and transit-oriented developments are complex to begin with. But the example you cited, it's cross-jurisdictional, right? And you got multiple stakeholders, which Alan probably knows better than all of us. But part of the concept of meeting stakeholder requirements and interest, one of our faculty, Professor Beasley, raises a good question. Was there a kind of go-to market, a bidding strategy? Did the state or authority have to run an RFP process, or did Carlisle how did Carlisle get into the project?
So typically this all open book in the public sector. Sometimes you'll hear something about an unsolicited approach, which means that the public sector received interest from a third party, could be a Carlisle, or could be a strategic company, regarding an asset and a long-term redevelopment idea. And typically what then happens is that it's turned into an RFI, RFP structure. So there's a ton of transparency. Carlisle won a bid. There was a broker, I think Morgan Stanley or somebody like that was involved for a while. And at the end of the day, a single bidder called the preferred bidder is chosen. At that point, a surety bond is put up to assure the capital for the execution of the investment while documents are being negotiated and closed.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, I think that was a great overview. I appreciate it. And I think a great segue for Alan. People on this call, students who know, if you live in New York, if you're a fan of architecture, Alan's project is kind of near and dear to you. And I think we could probably spend an entire semester going through all the nuances of getting to groundbreaking, so to speak. I see you shaking your head. So I'll pass.
I don't know if I can relive that.
I'm sure not. But I'll pass the baton to you. It's opened, it's getting there. We're all excited as New Yorkers, so love to hear a little bit more about it.
All right, I'm just gonna share my screen here. Just bear with me 1 second. So if I flip through the slides too fast, well, one, thank you for having me, Ray. Thanks for all the insight on the different structures. And I'm happy to be here as an alumni. Scott was my favorite professor during the program, so anytime he asked me to help, I'm glad to do it. So I figured before we jump into it, because Ray made so many points, I was trying to take notes on this that I really could touch on this, structure. One of the things he mentioned was trust, and without trust, you can't do a P3 partnership. So that's very important, and I'll try and get to it a little bit later, but I feel it's important to start off the presentation with the history of the building. And I'm talking about the original history, not the one that everyone's heard about with Senator Moynihan, because without that history setting up this project, we wouldn't be here today, because it made it such a home run candidate for an adaptive reuse of a historic building. So with that said, I'll flip through some slides, and first couple of slides just kind of give you this is just our pretty marketing rendering. This is, we don't have Roland Garros on there, but we do have a beautiful rooftop garden. So this building, the Farley building, was originally constructed as a pair to the original Penn Station. So as part of the original Penn Station, the Penn Railroad bought up all the land around this to create their railroads, to create their tunnels. And to offset mounting land costs from the assemblage, they said, what better place to unload some of these costs by selling the land directly adjacent above the tracks to the post office. So this is in the early 1900s. At that time, the Penn railroads carried about 90% of all US mail in this country. So think about it this way. The passengers were on the front of the trains, the mail was on the back of the trains. So Penn is on the east side and Farley's on the west side. So the tracks and all the general infrastructure you need to turn this place into a train hall were literally in place starting in the 1910s. So beautiful facade of the building. This is under construction. I love this one because it's such an iconic facade, and flipping through some old historic photos, we found this, and rarely have I ever seen a photo where it was under construction. This is the beautiful before it had seen some rough years in the 70s and 80s. Inside was this main sorting area. So this was the main post office for all of the country. And they created this large, vast room that sorted mail, and it had this skylight to provide light to the mail sorting people. So this is when it's first into use here. You see them actually sorting by hand. Then they modernized it to install pneumatic tubes to sort the mail. And this is what we turned it into. So we cut out the main slab of the building, and instead of it being a single story height space, we made a grand volume of space. We took out the old skylight that leaked starting since its initial construction, and we created this beautiful barrel vaulted skylight here. So this is just walking you through the process. This is the old loading dock that was from 1910. This is what it was like right around the time that we got involved in the project. And that's what it looked like as of a few days before January this year. So why this was the perfect project, the trains were directly under the building already. There was minimal effort needed to make the connectivity into the building. The USPS had reduced their footprint in the building. Originally, they occupied all 1.4 million square feet of the building. And at the time that they started talking with the state of New York, they had about 300 square feet in the building, and the rest was just left fallow. Some of the areas I walked through in 2016 hadn't been touched since literally the 1940s. And this just shows you that the tracks run all the way from 7th to 9th Avenue, and why this was perfect to really, it's too expensive to move Madison Square Garden off of Penn. You know, they're trying to do some stuff. We're involved over there to make it better. But the best way to take the pressure off of Penn was to move rail operations across the street. And because the rails and the platforms were underneath here, it allowed that to happen. So I'm going a little quickly, so apologize if I'm going too fast. This is my version of Ray's diagram of what a simplified P3 structure looks like. I view it as a Venn diagram of all the parties involved. And then there's outside parties that still have stakeholders in them, but really you have, for us, we had the main stakeholders were Vornado, Amtrak, MTA-LIR, our partner in the construction was Skanska, and the state of New York. And so basically we were all at the table negotiating the deal with all of ourselves. And then all these other attorneys or different agencies were on the outside and the periphery that we'd have to go back and do some shuttle diplomacy when we were agreeing to terms with our project stakeholders. We had to make sure that we could get financing. We had to make sure that the state of New York could get financing, that Skanska could provide the guarantee that they were providing. So this is where I'll touch base on really how the project got together recently. So back in 2006, Vornado was the designated developer with Related to build this train hall. For various reasons, the deal ended up imploding under the own weight. We were going to move Madison Square Garden to the back half of the building. The deal got way too complicated. Then the Great Recession happened. Everyone said, okay, let's go back to our respective corners and let's see where things fall in a few years from now. Now, one very important part happened during that, the project being put on pause, and that was ESD decided to say, you know what, the last time it got too big and too complicated, let's break off the pieces in bites, the project into bite-sized pieces. So they broke it up into 3 phases. The first phase was the West End Concourse, which is actually outside the building, but still integral to the building. And that allowed some additional connectivity to the rail yards into the building. And that was funded by ESD through a TIGER program, which is Transportation Improvements Generating Income Recovery. So that was one of the ways they utilized to fund a small portion of the project. And then back in 2016, we kept approaching ESD and saying, look, we love this building. We don't care if you're going to build a train hall. We want to buy our portion of the building. We're so bullish on a unique asset like this. We're willing to contribute. And so we were talking with them for quite a bit of time, and they came back to us and said, look, we can't close on a deal with you guys because the deal is stale. The 2006 terms will not pass our agencies and our approval boards that we need to, so we have to re-RFP it. So then we spent the second half of 2016 doing the RFP again, and then in 17 we were the designated developer. And so part of the reason that worked and we were awarded was Vornado is being a REIT. We have a balance sheet, a fortress balance sheet, as our chairman likes to say. So we were able to provide several guarantees that helped the state of New York get the financing they needed to fund the train hall. And we also had Skanska, which is a large publicly traded Swedish company. You'll see them, they do a lot of infrastructure in the city. They were able to provide a corporate guarantee along with Vornado. So 2 strong corporate guarantees that helped allow ESD to get some financing. So the financing for this project, for the train hall phase 2 portion, ESD contributed 700 million. That's the state of New York, and their development arm, ESD, contributed 700 million. And then based upon Vornado's guarantee of completing the train hall plus pilot, which is payment in lieu of taxes. So we don't have a tax bill here. We have a synthetic tax that we pay to the state of New York as opposed to the city of New York. The state then, because we're guaranteeing those funds, was able to get something called TIFIA financing, and that's the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. I'll touch base a little bit more on that once I go through the rest of the sources. The Port Authority of New York added about 150 million. Amtrak bought their condominium unit for 105 million. MTA contributed another $100 million. And then through the U.S. Transportation, we were able to get another $60+ million in grants for improvements we were doing, getting trucks off the sidewalk and into the building by putting the loading dock inside the building as opposed to at grade, and other Sandy type improvements. Plus Vornado contributed $230 million for our 99-year lease. So I'm going to stop there to address one of Ray's points of an upfront payment. And so the way our deal worked was we did do some upfront payment. However, by providing the guarantees and the pilot structure, it allowed, it was a mix of upfront payment plus long-term commitments that ESD could then monetize. In addition to that, we were responsible for delivering a train hall, which is it's a part of a condominium. So it wasn't like we were retaining the rights to the train hall. We were effectively doing it on the behalf of the railroads and our retail to deliver it. So it was a mixed bag, and that's how the interests were aligned, as opposed to, just the developer coming in and paying some right to be a part of the project. So those were the sources and uses that funded the train hall. The TIFIA portion of it was very attractive for ESD because it's 35-year financing. They're allowed to defer payments for the first 5 years. So they were allowed to draw once they closed on the loan, but defer the payments until the project was substantially complete. And this way it allowed our pilot payments to ramp up and for them to make the payments. And it's a very favorable rate. And additionally, the other source of funds that came to fund the train hall was ESD needed a little extra money. So as the developer, we did a very typical New York thing. We separated the air rights from the building, and that allowed ESD to take those air rights and then collateralize them with a loan from Citibank. So then phase 3 is the Vornado land. And that is, why we were willing to contribute $230 million, why we were willing to stand behind a pilot guarantee, why we love this building, why we were so bullish on it. And it really is an incredible building that is just, it's the only building that we know of that stretches from avenue to avenue across 2 city blocks. So this goes from 8th Avenue to 9th Avenue, from 33rd to 31st Street. One floor plan on here is 290,000 rentable square feet. So it's about 5 soccer fields across, if you look at it that way. And I'll get to a few slides that show that. But the reason why we really loved it, other than just size, was when we go out and talk to the TAMI tenants, the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks of the world, they're used to West Coast campuses, and they're used to horizontal buildings, and they deal in acreages as opposed to square feet. And in New York, we deal with verticality. How many floors do you have? What's your stack? But this building offered us an ability to give them a little bit of a campus type feel. Like I said, 290,000 square feet on one floor. You can get almost 3,000 employees on one floor here. So we just did a little fun little exhibit. This just showed what the overlay of the new Apple's campus would be, NVIDIA, Facebook, how these interplayed with what our footprint was here. Clearly, those are all much bigger floor plates, but they're all not in land constraint Manhattan or land constraint city. So our building, we took it next to our Manhattan West to the side, almost 1,000 square feet. We're effectively a 60-story tower laid on our side, which has all sorts of pros and cons to it. It makes you think differently about how you construct a building, how you build it, how you lay it out. But it is something that all these TAMI tenants really liked. So here I go with the 5 soccer fields on it. But this is what getting to these types of tenants and having a space unlike others in New York allowed us to want to contribute $230 million up front. It's an upfront payment of a 99-year ground lease. And we thought we could charge a premium rent, both because of the office space being unique and highly desirable. And we also have 130,000 square feet of station-oriented retail ringing the complex. So based upon our experience over at Penn Station across the way, the retail we have over there is some of the busiest in those organizations' portfolios. So Pret a Manger, that was the #1 Pret in the country. The Shake Shack is phenomenal. This Dwayne Reed, all of those stores, just because of footfall. And so this being an addition to Penn for the retail, even though the retail landscape is changing, more people are going direct to consumer, that the retail here and having it be adjacent to a train station would be able to weather the retail landscape changing. So the way we finance it, we got an original acquisition loan, which we then converted to an inter-party loan for Vornado and our partners, because we went out, cost of capital for construction was too high. So we just decided to give the project a loan internally. And then the other component that is very relevant for transportation, and especially this project, is we went out and applied for historic tax credits. So we went to the State Historic Preservation Office along with the National Park Service, showed them all the good work we're doing to restore this building that sat fallow for decades, to really restore it back to a beautiful new building that both office tenants, traveling public, general public, everyone would be able to experience and really bring life back into. So based upon the project costs, we were able to secure $180 million in tax credits, which we then partner up with a tax credit investor to effectively offload the tax credits, because being a REIT, it doesn't really work for us, but it is another source of funding. So we brought on a tax credit investor with us. And that's how we're able to fund the back half of the building, which we call phase 3. And what so far has been a very successful project. We announced yesterday we're delivering the second part of the Facebook lease space on June 1. We have a substantial portion of our concourse retail leased. And then once we open up the concourse, we're then going to focus on the first floor of the building and that portion of the retail, which should open to the general public later this year. So that was a lot of fast talking. So Scott, if I missed anything or I need to go back, please let me know.
Thank you, Alan. Look, this is clearly a case where the student has far surpassed anything the professor was ever able to do. So nice job getting through this in real life. Look, it's a huge project. And the commercial value is probably not as apparent in this as some other projects, which means that federal and the public funding is very important. We can get into the multiplier effect, if you will, of surrounding development that gets kicks off as the transportation development kind of acts as a catalyst for that surrounding development. You guys Vornado's doing a lot in the surrounding area. I'm kind of tiptoeing around this a little bit, but is there a way for you to speak to how this project is really kicking off, and if there's additional 3P monies that's needed for some of the surrounding projects in the area, and kind of what that multiplier effect might look like?
Sure. We view this as kind of the bow tie between our 9 million square feet of holdings to the east. You have Brookfield doing great work to the west, and then you have Hudson Yards even further there. So we felt this really was the gateway between those pieces. So we think that we've seen, as soon as we started this project, the building just to the south, I think it was a trade college just south of us, traded hands because someone said, okay, now Farley's going ahead. This is a prime development site for the next one because it'll be right next to the building. So we're already seeing people in the neighborhood trying to kind of, use this project as the linchpin to do more development. We're involved with the state of New York and the MTA right now to expand the Long Island Concourse down, which is on the other side of Penn. We're the developer for that as well. And that's the area that's most congested in Penn Station. And we partnered with the state of New York because they controlled one half of the aisle, we controlled the other half of the aisle. We're pushing back our retail. We're restructuring the deal because, one, having that space be better for both parties makes it more enjoyable for the commuters, makes the retail more desirable. So this was another partnership area where both parties that owned adjacent land decided to do it. That's coming from a combination of our funding and the state funding. I can't really get too far down the rabbit holes in that, but that's another infrastructure project that's going on down the way. And then we are involved in a general project plan with the state of New York for the surrounding areas to further improve a rather congested area. And so that'll be more along the lines of improving Penn and what other public realm improvements can you do as a developer along with the redevelopment of your own buildings.
Cool.
So-
Thanks. I'd also encourage my students who have interest in the area and to dig into this aspect in greater detail, go to Vornado's site and do a little digging around about the proposed tracking stock they're looking at spinning off. We can always talk about that more offline. Sabya.
Alan, I had a question in regards to these big transportation-oriented development projects like this is a historic building, is a lot of times funded by the Park Authority or the Landmark Society funding. What are the constraints of getting funding from them so that private capital gets involved more in this field?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because in order to qualify for historic tax credits, you have to meet the National Park restoration standard, and it's not the easiest standard to get through. The way I like to put it is the National Park Service doesn't like trees. And I say that joking around because we wanted the landscape portions of it, and they want historic buildings to be historic, and rightfully so. But so when you look at an area that now you say, well, this should be a terrace, they say, well, that wasn't a terrace before, it shouldn't necessarily be a terrace. So we had to have lots of meetings with the State Historic Preservation Office of what interventions were allowed and not allowed. And it really is a case-by-case, building-by-building case. I mean, there's a set of standards everyone should read if they're interested in it. It's not the most exciting read, but there are a set of standards, but you do then have to apply it to the characteristics of your building. So one of the reasons we were allowed to change the skylight here was because there was a skylight previously, but had we cut a hole in the roof and put a new skylight in, that might not have met the standard for them. So it really is, they want the building to be restored back as close to its original intention as possible. And depending on the level of restoration you're doing, the more restoration you're doing, the more interventions they'll allow you elsewhere in the building. So if you walk into Farley, it's a perfect example of the full exterior of the building was restored. There are very few interventions on the facade because the facade is such an important piece to the historic elements. There was 2 new entrances put in. All the windows were replaced. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot more done on the exterior of the building. And so when you walk in, you think it's this old building, and then you come into the train hall and you have a modern train hall. So because we did so much work on the outside and didn't touch the outside, they allowed us to do a little bit more on the inside. But it's a Ray's point. You should get a consultant to figure out the markets for all the different structure available for your infrastructure projects. This is where I would say that we hired one of the best historic preservation consultants I've ever dealt with. And he really helped us on like, that's not going to pass. You should look how to do it this way. And it was very interesting because we had to worry about the train hall, obviously. We also had to worry about what works for the office tenant, because they were concerned the upper floors of the building were office. They were old traditional offices of just not open plan offices like you'd see today. It was all individual offices with corridors. And we wanted it to be all open modern office space. And that was something that was at one point questionable of whether or not that would get approved. And so that really led us to, if we take this tax credit money, does it allow us to still lease it, right? And if, because that comes to, can we then finance it?
It's interesting, Alan, just to build on those points. We looked at historic tax credits for the smaller rest stops along the Merritt Parkway, which if anyone's been up it, you'll know that they're these little brick buildings that had room for about 1 gas pump and barely enough room if you're in a underpowered car to get back onto the Merritt. And so for us, for those assets, the constraint really was safety, number one, really not being able to alter the footprint of those, but to really just enhance, as you were saying, Alan, the use of space on the existing footprint. So being able to angle the gas station pumps and allow for increased volume. And then also over on 95, to be able to allow for multiple parking areas and a full reconfiguration. Most of those were, as you were saying, like at Darien, the McDonald's there was like the first or second highest grossing McDonald's in the country. And then so building on that, how do we allow more volume? So the role of technology was actually a very strong consideration. I know you were talking about capital sources, but the technology allows you to also access a little bit more in the way of capital and capital sources by virtue of being able to support a defensible forecast for the changes that you're going to be implementing, and what does that cash flow forecast look like. And so a big component of that we had to convince the banks and others around was the flow. So, and there's a ton of cars passing by I-95, but how are you going to actually get more cars and more footfall into the rest areas? So there are multiplier effects sometimes within the same footprint that are really important for the students and others here to consider. And what's the role of technology in that, both from a developer's perspective, and there was a question on prop tech, which I'm not an expert in, but also from an investor's perspective in terms of the apps that are now prevalent. You can order your food ahead, you're going to stop for gas, you can do pickup. So all of this was incorporated into the flow to be able to increase the volume at the rest areas, which again provided alignment of interest for all constituencies. The users could stop and refuel more efficiently with less time. The bathrooms were clean. They could pick up a cup of coffee and not have to wait in line, and they could get back on the highway.
It's a good point, and kind of echoes Sabya's open comments about all the different paths of conversations we could have around this, right? Tech, climate change, quality of life. But it also sounds like from both of your projects that one of the key aspects to success is flexibility and communication. I don't want to steal your thunder on that answer, but since we're running out of time, maybe we'll kind of wrap up the conversation a little bit with, from your point of view, what are some key components to success for a complex PPP transit-oriented development?
I'm happy to just kick off again. I think trust and developing trust is the first thing. So it's coming in and having a convincing and executable and reasonable proposition, a business proposition, not showing pie in the sky projections, not showing disregard for all the constituencies. For example, we worked very closely with the SEIU, which is a union that is responsible for a number of the job and other positions that we were creating in order to get their buy-in. So as Alan said, it's really communication that helps develop that trust through the process. And it's not always the lowest or cost or the highest amount of money that goes into the bid. It's a blend of your ability to develop, your reputation for delivering, the personality fit as well. And in the case of many of these public entities, there's a certain, sort of guilt, not guilty, but prove it to me, because I haven't really been through this before, and I really don't want to lose my job if this doesn't work out. So there's not a lot of upside for any of the folks that private sector developers and others are talking with around the table. And that's why the Venn diagram, I think, is so key, is really being very transparent in those conversations is critical, and making sure that you put yourself in each other's shoes to really be able to deliver the best project and have everyone be able to consider it a success.
Ray hit the nail on the head. I mean, I can't, couldn't have said it better.
Trust, communication, respect sounds like good words of wisdom for our grad students as they wrap down their semester and move on into their careers. So appreciate your time and insight today. I think these were really interesting projects. Definitely got me excited. Looking forward to moving through both of these projects soon. Sabya, you want to take us out?
I think it is a pleasure to have both of you as speakers. It was, I think, very insightful. I'm hoping our attendees got a new insight into the industry and add on more to the work done here. Thank you, everyone.